The knife was already at his throat when the door burst open. "Let him go," Jin-ho said, stepping into the warehouse light, "or I burn everything your family built in one night." The man holding the blade, younger, faster, hungrier for power than Jin-ho had ever been, just laughed. "Funny," he said. "She told me you'd say exactly that." Jin-ho went still. She could only mean one person. Emily Rose stepped out from behind the younger man, and for one unbearable second, Jin-ho couldn't tell whose side she was standing on. 15 years ago, he'd pulled her off the street, half-starved, nameless, dying in the rain. He had given her a home, an education, a life. He had never asked for anything back, except, quietly, hopelessly, her heart. Tonight, that heart was standing 3 feet from his greatest enemy, and it wasn't looking at Jin-ho at all. "Emily," he said, low, almost pleading, "tell me this isn't what it looks like." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The way her hand found the younger man's sleeve said everything Jin-ho needed to know, and everything he refused to accept. Somewhere behind them, sirens began to rise. "Then I guess," Jin-ho said, voice breaking into something colder, "we do this the hard way." Before we rewind to where this all began, who do you think Emily truly loves? The man who saved her life or the one who makes her feel alive? Tell us your theory below. We'll see who called it right by the end. 3 names, 3 destinies about to collide. Jin-ho Choi, 20 years spent building an empire out of blood, silence, and iron discipline. A man feared in every port from Busan to Los Angeles, and a man who had never once let himself be loved. Min Jun Baek, young, brilliant, and dangerously charming, heir to a rival house Jin-ho had spent a decade trying to bury. Ambitious in a way that made older men nervous, and patient in a way that made them nervous still. And Emily Rose, the girl Jin-ho found dying in an alley 15 years ago, the woman he raised, educated, and protected, but never once let close enough to call his own. How does a man who conquered an empire lose the one thing he never dared to fight for? Why does the girl he saved end up standing beside the one man built to destroy him? And when everything falls apart, who does her heart choose when there's nothing left to hide behind? This is a story about power, betrayal, and the kind of love that only reveals itself once it's almost lost. It is also, in the end, a story about a son who was wanted for 15 years before he was ever born. Stay with us, it only gets more dangerous from here. Seoul, autumn. Rain hammering broken pavement in the city's forgotten district, the kind of rain that made even stray dogs seek shelter. A 9-year-old girl huddled beneath a bridge, arms wrapped around her knees, lips blue from cold. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. She didn't remember her mother's face anymore, only the sound of a car door slamming and the silence that came after, and the years of shelters and strangers' houses that followed, each one colder than the last. She would learn later that her name, Emily Rose, was the only inheritance her Nigerian mother had left her, whispered into a Korean orphanage intake form nobody bothered to read twice. A nurse had written it down wrong the first time. Emily corrected her, age 6, in a voice too quiet to be heard. Nobody heard her again for 3 years. That night, a black sedan rolled to a stop at the mouth of the alley, highlights cutting through the downpour like something out of a fable the girl was too hungry to believe in. The man who stepped out wore a suit that meant nothing to a starving child, but his eyes, calm, unreadable, terrifyingly patient, she would remember for the rest of her life. Jin-ho Choi was 26 years old, already a name whispered in fear across 3 districts, already a man who had done things that should have made him immune to a stranger's suffering. His driver had told him to keep moving. His bodyguard had told him it wasn't safe to stop. He stopped anyway. He crouched in front of her, careful not to crowd her, the way a man learns to approach something wounded and unpredictable. "Are you alone?" She didn't answer. Hunger had taken her voice days ago. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders without another word. It smelled like cedar and cigarette smoke and something she would later learn to call safety. By the end of that week, Emily had a bed, a roof, and a tutor. A woman named Miss Han taught her Korean in the mornings and English in the afternoons, and within a month, Emily was correcting her woman's grammar with a defiance that made even Jin-ho's most hardened men smile. By the end of that year, she had a name people said with a kind of caution, Choi's ward, and a version of safety no child in her position should have expected to survive long enough to receive. She had nightmares for the first 8 months. Jin-ho never asked about them.
He simply began leaving his study door open at night, so that when she woke crying, there was always a light on somewhere in the house. He never explained why he did it, not to his men, who questioned nothing. Questioning Jin-ho Choi was not a habit that led to long careers. Not to Emily, who was too afraid to ask, certain that asking might undo whatever fragile miracle had brought her here. And certainly not to himself, in the quiet hours when he stood outside her door at night, making sure the house was secure, telling himself it was duty and nothing more. He built walls around his empire, concrete, steel, silence, fear. He built higher ones around his heart, and without meaning to, he built the tallest wall of all around Emily, mistaking distance for protection, telling himself that a girl who had lost everything didn't need a man like him getting closer. She needed safety, she needed structure, she needed, above all, never to see what he really was. She grew up fast in that house, discipline before affection, language lessons before laughter. By 16, she spoke 4 languages and could read a balance sheet the way other girls read magazines, catching discrepancies his own accountants missed. By 20, she managed half his legitimate businesses without anyone questioning why a mafia boss trusted a woman raised on his charity with his money. Because by then, everyone who knew Jin-ho Choi understood that Emily Rose was not charity. She had made herself indispensable, and she had done it without once asking him for anything beyond what he'd already given. She adored him, worshipped him in the quiet, aching way a person loves the only home they've ever known. She memorized the way he took his tea, no sugar, a single slice of lemon, before she ever admitted to herself why she bothered to remember it. She learned to read his silences the way other people read faces, understanding within seconds whether his quiet meant satisfaction or restrained fury. But Jin-ho never once looked at her as anything other than a responsibility. Or so she believed, because he had spent 15 years perfecting the art of never letting her see otherwise. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that every time she laughed at something one of his men said, every time she wore red because she knew somehow it was his favorite color, even though he'd never told her, Jin-ho noticed and hated himself a little more for noticing. He would leave the room under some invented pretext, walk the length of the garden twice, and return with his expression locked back into place. He was more than a decade her senior, hardened by things she would never fully know about, and he told himself the gap between them was a mercy, a reason to stay silent, a reason to keep her at arm's length, safe from the kind of man he really was. a man who had ordered things done that would have made her look at him differently had she ever known the full weight of what his empire required. So he never said anything, and Emily, mistaking his silence for indifference, slowly stopped hoping he ever would. By 24, she had built her own walls to match his, quieter but no less sturdy, telling herself that gratitude was enough, that she didn't need more than a home, a purpose, a place in his world. She was wrong, and it would take an outsider to show her exactly how wrong. There was one night when Emily was 17 that she would return to often in memory without ever quite understanding why it mattered so much. She had come home late from a school event, soaked from an unexpected storm, and found Jin-ho still awake in the study, papers spread across his desk, a single lamp burning against the dark. He looked up when she came in, took one look at her drenched uniform, and without a word disappeared upstairs, returning a moment later with a towel and a dry blanket. He didn't hand them to her, he draped the blanket over her shoulders himself, the way he had once draped his coat over a starving child in the rain, his hands lingering a half-second longer than duty required before he stepped back. "You'll catch a cold," he said, voice rough with something she couldn't name. "You could just say you were worried," she teased, testing the boundary the way only a 17-year-old dares to. "I could," he agreed, and said nothing else, returning to his desk as though the moment hadn't happened at all. She had gone to bed that night turning the exchange over and over, cataloging it among the small, wordless kindnesses that made up the entire language of affection Jin-ho Choi seemed capable of speaking. It would be years before she understood that his silence hadn't been coldness, it had been restraint. A man 12 years her senior, guilty for even noticing how she'd grown, disciplining himself out of a feeling he considered unforgivable. Neither of them ever mentioned it again, but Emily kept the blanket for years, long after it had frayed at the edges, telling herself it was simply practical, never quite admitting why she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. The following spring, a merger negotiation brought two rival houses to the same table for the first time in a decade, a fragile, carefully brokered peace neither side entirely trusted.
Min Jun-baek walked into that boardroom like he already owned it. 28 years old, Harvard-educated, ruthless in a boardroom, and disarmingly warm in a way that made grown men underestimate him at their peril. His father had lost everything to Jin-ho a decade earlier. Territory, reputation, half his fortune, a humiliation that had followed the Baek name through every circle that mattered. Min Jun had spent every year since rebuilding, quietly, patiently, waiting for a seat at this exact table, telling no one, not even himself some days, how much of his ambition was business and how much was something closer to a debt he intended to collect. He noticed Emily before he noticed the numbers on the page, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in a way that seemed unaware of itself, but because she was the only person in that room who challenged Jin-ho's proposal without flinching, without glancing sideways first to gauge whether it was safe to disagree. "Your terms undervalue our logistics network by 20%, she said, sliding a folder across the table without looking up. "I'd revise before Mr. Choi embarrasses himself further." Jin-ho's jaw tightened, somewhere between pride and warning, the corner of his mouth betraying something that was almost, dangerously, a smile. Min Jun laughed, genuinely, delighted, the sound cutting through the tension in the room like something unrehearsed. "I like her," he said, to no one in particular, though his eyes stayed on Emily a beat too long. Emily finally looked up, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone looked back at her like a woman in the room, not an asset to be managed, not Choi's ward, not a story that began in an alley 15 years ago, just Emily. The negotiations dragged into weeks. Weeks turned into a professional rhythm, private calls to iron out contract details, clarifying emails sent later and later into the night, a familiarity neither of them acknowledged out loud. At first, it was only business. Emily told herself that every time she found a reason to stay 10 minutes longer on a call than the topic required. Then, one evening in early summer, Min-jun asked her to stay after a meeting had already ended, the boardroom emptying around them until it was just the two of them and the city lights beginning to flicker on beyond the glass. "You could have humiliated me in there today," he said. "You didn't. Why?" Emily considered the question longer than she expected to. "Because cruelty isn't the same as strength. Someone taught me that a long time ago. He just forgot to apply it to himself." Min-jun studied her, something curious and warm in his expression. "Sounds like a complicated man." "You have no idea." He smiled, not the practiced boardroom smile, but something quieter, more careful. "Have dinner with me. Not business, just dinner." She should have said no. Every rule she'd absorbed in that house, every instinct trained into her over 15 years of careful distance, told her to say no. "Okay," she said instead, and felt something reckless and unfamiliar loosen in her chest. The dinners became a habit neither of them named, small restaurants tucked away from the districts where either of their families held influence, corner tables, conversations that stretched long after the food had gone cold. Min-jun asked about her childhood, and she found herself telling him things she'd never told Jin-ho, not because Jin-ho hadn't asked, but because some part of her had always feared that admitting how much she'd suffered before him would make her seem less capable of standing beside him now, less like an equal and more like the frightened child he'd found under a bridge. Min-jun didn't need her to be capable, he just wanted her to be honest. "You talk about him like he built you, not like he raised you," Min-jun said one night, swirling wine he'd barely touched. Emily flinched, the observation landing somewhere she hadn't expected it to reach. "That's not fair." "Maybe not, but is it wrong?" She didn't answer. She didn't have one, and the silence between them said more than any answer could. Then he reached across the table then, not quite touching her hand, just close enough that she felt the warmth of it. "I'm not trying to take anything from you. I just want to know you as you are now, not as whoever's story you've been living inside." It was, she would realize much later, either the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her or the most calculated. By the end of the month, what had started as stolen conversations became something neither of them could pretend was professional anymore. Emily found herself checking her phone for his messages the way she used to wait for Jin-ho's approval, a small, greedy hope she was ashamed of and couldn't stop. It happened on a rooftop overlooking the Han River, city lights scattered like something too fragile to be real, the two of them having climbed the service stairs of Min-jun's building on a whim, laughing at nothing in particular. "I know what you are," Emily said quietly, the laughter fading into something more serious. "I know whose son you are. I know exactly what this looks like."
"Then tell me to stop," Min-jun said, stepping closer, giving her the space to refuse. She didn't. He closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to step back, his hand rising to brush a strand of hair from her face, like he was asking a question with his fingertips. Their first kiss was soft, deliberate, and terrifying in the way only forbidden things can be, the kind of kiss that rewrites everything a person thought they knew about themselves, about what they were allowed to want. When it ended, Emily pressed her forehead to his, breathless, her heart hammering in a way 15 years of discipline hadn't prepared her for. "This is a mistake," she whispered. "Probably," Min-jun agreed, smiling against her skin. "Stay anyway." She did.
By the second week of June, even Jin-ho's most loyal men had noticed the change in him, a distraction that didn't suit a man famous for missing nothing. He caught himself asking Emily's assistant more than once whether she'd made it home safely from a business dinner, a question he had never needed to ask in 15 years because Emily always told him herself, unprompted, the way a daughter tells a father. Lately, she didn't. Lately, her updates had grown shorter, vaguer, timed to arrive just late enough that he couldn't ask a natural follow-up question without it sounding like exactly what it was. He told himself he was imagining it. He was not a man given to imagining things. One evening, passing her office on his way to a meeting, he heard her laughing on the phone, a real laugh, unguarded, nothing like the polished warmth she used with clients. He stopped in the hallway longer than he intended to, some old, unfamiliar ache tightening in his chest at a sound he realized, with quiet horror, he could not remember ever earning from her himself. He didn't ask who was on the other end. He told himself it didn't matter. It was Deputy Song 3 days later who finally decided it mattered enough to bring him the folder. Jin-ho found out the way every powerful man eventually finds the truth he's been avoiding through someone else's mouth at the worst possible moment when he was least prepared to hear it. His head of security, a quiet man named Deputy Song, who had served Jin-ho for over a decade, delivered the photograph without expression, the way he delivered every piece of bad news, sliding the folder across the desk and stepping back as though putting distance between himself and whatever came next. Emily, laughing on a rooftop, Minjin's hand at the small of her back, her face turned toward him in a way Jin-ho had never once seen her look at anyone else. Jin-ho stared at the image longer than he needed to, long enough that Song shifted his weight, uncertain whether to speak again. "Confirm it," Jin-ho said finally, voice flat, giving nothing away. "Sir, it's already confirmed. 3 weeks now, dinners mostly. Last week, the rooftop." 3 weeks. Jin-ho had sat across from her in dinner 4 times in those 3 weeks, had watched her smile at something on her phone and assumed it was nothing, a friend, an amusing headline, anything but this. He dismissed his men and sat alone in his office until the city outside went dark and then slowly, imperceptibly, began to lighten again toward dawn. He told himself it was about security, about the danger of Emily being close to Baek's son, about the intelligence risk her position gave to a rival house, about business, about everything except the truth sitting heavy in his chest. It took him until 3 in the morning to admit the truth to the empty room. It wasn't fear for his empire keeping him awake. It was the unbearable, humiliating realization that somewhere in 15 years of raising her, protecting her, watching her become the extraordinary woman across that boardroom table, Jin-ho Choi had fallen in love with the girl he'd once wrapped in his coat, and he had waited 15 years too long to say so. And that's when he realized the empire he'd spent his life building meant nothing next to the one thing he'd never let himself claim. The confrontation came the next evening in the study where Emily had done her homework as a child, the same desk, the same shelves of books he'd bought her one at a time as she outgrew each subject. "You could have told me," Jin-ho said, standing at the window, back to her, unable to look at her directly while the words still felt unsteady in his mouth. "Told you what?" Emily's voice was careful, guarded in a way it had never been with him before. "That I found someone who talks to me like I'm not a project you're managing?" He turned, something in his expression she'd never seen before, not anger, not the cold control she'd grown up fearing and admiring in equal measure, something rawer, something that looked almost like fear. "Do you know who his family is, what they did, what I did to them?" I know exactly who he is, Emily said, her chin lifting. I also know who I am to you. A ward, an asset, a very well-managed investment. That's not— Jinho stopped himself, the sentence collapsing before he could finish it. Then what am I? Her voice cracked, 15 years of unspoken hope finally breaking the surface all at once. Because I have spent my whole life trying to be worth the coat you put on my shoulders, Jinho, and you have never once told me I was anything more than obligation. You are not an obligation, Jinho said, sharper than he meant to, the words escaping before he could measure them. Do you have any idea what I would burn down to keep you safe? I don't want to be kept safe, Emily said. I want to be chosen. There's a difference, and in 15 years you never once let me see if you understood it. He crossed the room then, closer than he'd allowed himself to stand in years, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. For a moment something passed between them that neither had ever permitted to surface, an old buried current finally rising to the air. Emily. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it had ever had before, stripped of the careful distance he'd always kept in it. There are things about the man I am that you don't know, things that would make you look at me the way you're afraid to look at Bok's son right now, if you knew the truth of it. Then tell me, for once in 15 years, just tell me the truth. He almost did. She would think about that moment for years afterward, the half-second where his jaw worked, where something in his eyes softened toward the edge of a confession he'd carried since she was 9 years old and freezing under a bridge. And then, just as quickly, the wall came back up, the old discipline reasserting itself, 20 years of never showing weakness closing over whatever he'd almost let her see. He stepped back instead. The distance between them, once closed, opened again, wider this time than it had ever been. The room went silent, the only sound the distant hum of the city beyond the window. He could have said it then. Every part of him wanted to. The words sat in his throat like something too heavy to lift, 15 years of practiced restraint pressing down on the one sentence that might have changed everything. Go, he said instead. If that's what you want, I won't stop you. It was the wrong thing to say, and some distant part of him knew it even as he said it, but pride, forged over 20 years of never showing weakness, closed his mouth around the truth one more time. Emily left the study with her chin high and her heart in pieces, mistaking his silence once again for indifference. She didn't see him sit down heavily in the chair behind his desk the moment the door closed, didn't see him press the heel of his hand hard against his eyes, didn't hear the single ragged breath he allowed himself before straightening his shoulders and becoming, once again, a man no one was permitted to see break. By the following week she had moved into an apartment Min-Jun arranged near the river. His gift, he said, though Emily suspected it was also a message to Jinho, deliberate and sharp as a blade, the kind of gesture a man made when he wanted his rival to know exactly what he'd lost. The apartment was beautiful, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the water, furniture Min-Jun had chosen with a care that felt at the time like devotion. Emily told herself she was happy. Min-Jun was attentive, easy to talk to, generous with affection in a way Jinho had never learned to be. Quick with compliments, quick to notice when she was tired, quick to fill silences that Jinho would have simply let sit. Her closest friend, a sharp-tongued marketing director named Grace, who'd known her since university, wasn't as convinced. You moved out in a week, Grace said over coffee, studying Emily with the particular scrutiny only an old friend can get away with. People don't run that fast towards something, they run that fast away from something. I'm not running from anything, I'm finally living for myself. Okay. Grace didn't push, but she didn't look away either. And the fact that the something you're living for is the son of the man Jinho spent 10 years destroying, that's just a coincidence? Emily didn't have an answer for that one either. She changed the subject and Grace let her, the way good friends do when they know pushing further will only build a wall instead of taking one down. But some nights, alone on her new balcony with a cup of tea she made the way Jin-ho had once taught her, no sugar, a single slice of lemon, she found herself staring towards the part of the city where his house stood, its lights barely visible from this distance, and feeling the shape of a question she wasn't ready to ask herself. Was this love, or was this simply the first door that opened after 15 years of a closed one? She didn't have an answer yet. Min-jun, for his part, watched her during these quiet moments with an expression she never caught, one that held less tenderness than calculation, the look of a man checking the progress of something he'd been building for a long time, patient as ever, waiting for the moment it would finally pay off. She would have an answer to her question before this story was over, but it would cost her more than she could imagine finding out, and it would take losing far more than an apartment with a view of the river before she understood exactly what Min-jun Bak had truly wanted from her all along. What Emily didn't know that first month in the apartment by the river was that Min-jun kept a second phone, one she had never seen, one that lived in a locked drawer of his home office. Some nights after she'd fallen asleep against his shoulder, he would slip out of bed, open that drawer, and send a single line to his father's oldest advisor. Progress continues. Choi is distracted. Give it time. He would return to bed afterward and pull her close again, and some nights, watching her sleep, he almost forgot the second phone existed at all. Almost. It was never a lie, exactly, that he felt something for her. That was the part he hadn't planned on, the part that complicated a strategy he'd been building since before he ever sat across from her at that negotiating table. He told himself the two things could exist side by side, the plan and whatever this was becoming. He told himself a man could want two things at once and still be in control of both. He was wrong about that, too. But it would be many weeks yet before the cost of that mistake came due, for him, for Jin-ho, and most of all for the woman caught unknowing between them both. For now, on the balcony above the river, Emily only knew that for the first time in her life, someone had chosen her first. She held on to that feeling with both hands, unaware of how much of it was real and how much had been built, brick by careful brick, to bring her exactly here. Min-jun found her there most nights, wrapped in one of his sweaters against the river wind, and each time he joined her, some part of him meant every word he said next. "You don't have to keep looking over there," he told her once, following her gaze toward the distant lights of Jin-ho's house. "Whatever he was to you, you don't owe him your whole life." "He saved my life," Emily said quietly. "That's not a debt that just disappears because I moved into a nicer apartment." "I'm not asking you to forget him," Min-jun said, sitting beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers. "I'm asking you to let yourself have something that's just yours, not his legacy, not his ward, just this, us." She let her head fall against his shoulder, and for a while neither of them spoke, the city humming quietly below them, the river catching the last of the evening light. "Sometimes I think you understand me better than he ever tried to," Emily admitted. Min-jun pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and if his expression held anything other than tenderness in that moment, Emily didn't see it. Didn't see the brief, calculating flicker in his eyes before it dissolved back into warmth. Didn't hear the second phone buzzing once, softly, in the drawer inside. "Then let me," he murmured against her hair, "let me be the one who finally gets it right." She closed her eyes, and for the length of that evening at least, she believed him completely. By midsummer, Jin-ho's empire had begun to feel the cost of his distraction. A shipment delayed at the port because he'd signed off on the wrong manifest, distracted mid-signature by a memory of Emily's laugh through a hallway wall. A negotiation with a Busan supplier that nearly collapsed because Jin-ho, for the first time in 20 years, forgot a name mid-sentence, the supplier's daughter's name, the small, courteous detail he always remembered, gone from his mind because he'd spent the night before staring at a photograph he should have burned. Deputy Song noticed. Everyone noticed. No one dared say anything until his oldest lieutenant, a broad, graying man named Director O, who had served Jin-ho since Emily existed in his life at all, finally sat across from him one night with 2 glasses of soju neither of them touched. "You're bleeding out over a woman," O said bluntly, "and you've let the whole organization watch you do it." "Careful," Jin-ho said, low. "I've buried 3 men for you, Jin-ho. I've earned the right to be careful with something other than my tongue." Oh leaned forward. "Go get her back or let her go completely. This, whatever this is going to get someone killed." Jin-ho didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth sat in the silence between them, plain as the empty glasses on the table. Meanwhile, across the river, Emily's new life had begun to reveal small cracks she didn't yet want to name. Min-jun was attentive, generous, endlessly charming, but there were nights he disappeared for hours without explanation, returning distracted, his phone locked in a drawer she'd learned to ask about. There were moments his warmth felt just slightly like a performance calibrated for an audience of 1. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself more than once that comparing him to Jin-ho wasn't fair, that Jin-ho's silences never meant anything good either. But one evening, arriving early to surprise him with dinner, she overheard the tail end of a phone call through his study door, his voice pitched low in a way she'd never heard him use with her. "It doesn't matter how long it takes. Every month she stays, Choi's grip on the northern shipping routes weakens. Let her believe whatever she wants. The plan hasn't changed." Emily stood frozen in the hallway, the dinner she'd carried suddenly heavy as stone in her hands. The plan hasn't changed. She told herself there had to be another explanation. She told herself this for 3 days, refusing to let the sentence mean what it so plainly meant, the same way she'd once refused to believe Jin-ho's silence meant indifference. And that's when she began to wonder how much of what she'd believed about her own escape had ever truly been about her at all. She confronted him on a Thursday, the folder of shipping documents she'd quietly pulled from his desk drawer sitting between them on the kitchen counter, like an accusation neither of them wanted to say out loud first. "Tell me what this is," Emily said, sliding the folder toward him. "Tell me why you have detailed logs of every Choi shipment for the past 3 months. Min-jun's face did something complicated, surprise, then calculation, then something that almost looked like relief, as though a weight he'd been carrying had finally been set down. "It's not what you think," he said. "Then what is it?" He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words the way a man chooses a path through a minefield. "My father lost everything to that man, not just money, everything. Reputation, allies, a decade of his life fighting to rebuild from nothing while Choi's empire grew fat on what used to be ours." His jaw tightened. "I told myself for years that getting close to you was strategy, a way to weaken him. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because you deserve better than another lie in this house." Emily's stomach turned to ice. So all of this, the dinners, the apartment, this, she gestured at the space around them, it was always about him? It started that way, Min-jun said, and for the first time his composure cracked, something raw and unpracticed showing through. But Emily, it didn't stay that way. Somewhere in the last few months, this stopped being about Choi and started being about you. I know how that sounds. I know I don't deserve you believing it, but it's true. You don't get to decide what I believe, Emily said, voice shaking. You took that choice from me the moment you decided I was a means to an end. She left that night with only what she'd carried in, the apartment by the river suddenly feeling like exactly what it had always been, a beautifully furnished trap she'd walked into willingly, blind to the door closing behind her. She didn't go to Jin-ho, not at first. Pride kept her away for 4 days, 4 days spent in a hotel room, staring at a ceiling, replaying every conversation with Min-jun through the lens of what she now knew, searching for the moment the performance had started, wondering if she'd ever find the line where it had genuinely become real, or if that line had ever existed at all. It was Director O, of all people, who found her. He's been having every hotel in the district watched, O admitted, sitting across from her in the hotel lobby, looking distinctly uncomfortable in a role that clearly wasn't his. Not because he wants to control you, because he's terrified something happened to you, and he doesn't know how to say that to your face without it sounding like control. Why are you telling me this? Because I've watched that man survive things that would break lesser people, O said, and I have never once seen him look as lost as he has these past 2 months. Someone needed to say something before he did something stupid trying to fix it himself. Emily returned to the house that night and found Jin-ho exactly where she expected, alone in his study, the same lamp burning against the dark, the same posture she remembered from the night he'd wrapped a blanket around her shoulders 8 years ago. He looked up. Whatever composure he'd built the past 2 months collapsed the instant he saw her face. "What happened?" he asked, already moving toward her, already reaching for her before he caught himself and stopped, hands falling back to his sides. "I found out what Min-jun really wanted," I said quietly. "You were right to be worried, just not about the reasons I thought." She told him everything, the overheard call, the confrontation, the 4 days alone in a hotel room trying to determine which parts of the last 3 months had ever been real. Jin-ho listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, though his hands, she noticed, had curled into fists at his sides at some point during her account and never fully relaxed again. When she finished, the silence between them stretched long enough that Emily wondered if he intended to say something at all. "I should have told you the truth 2 months ago," Jin-ho said, finally. "Instead, I let my pride decide what you deserved to hear. I've made a great many mistakes in my life, Emily. That one I regret more than any of them." "Then tell me now," she echoed, the words she'd used in this very room 2 months ago. "Whatever it is, I'm asking you to trust me with it." Jin-ho crossed the room, and this time he didn't stop himself from closing the distance completely. I have loved you since you were old enough for me to be ashamed of loving you, he said, the words coming out rough, unpracticed, 20 years of discipline finally giving way all at once.
I told myself it was wrong. I told myself the difference in our ages, the things I've done, the life I've lived, none of it deserved to be anywhere near someone as good as you. So I said nothing for 15 years and told myself that silence was a kindness. Emily's breath caught. It wasn't. I know that now. He reached up, slowly, giving her every chance to step back the way Min-jun once had on a rooftop that felt like a lifetime ago. She didn't take it. Their kiss was nothing like the first one she'd shared with someone else. It wasn't reckless or new. It was 15 years of restraint finally breaking, careful and devastating all at once, the kind of kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like something that had always been inevitable, delayed only by two stubborn hearts too afraid to risk what they already had. When it ended, Jin-ho rested his forehead against hers, breathing unsteadily. I should have done that the night you turned 21, he murmured. You were an idiot not to, Emily said, laughing through unexpected tears. I've been called worse. And that's when she realized the home she'd been searching for had never been an apartment by the river. It had been standing in this study the entire time, waiting for her to see it. The peace lasted no long. Min-jun, humiliated and desperate, made one final move to salvage what his father's decade-long campaign had been building toward. He leaked the merger's confidential shipping routes to a third rival family, timing the exposure to coincide with a summit where Jin-ho's most valuable alliances were set to be finalized. A move calculated to destroy Jin-ho's empire in one stroke, and to make certain that even if he lost Emily, he'd lose everything else alongside her. The fallout was immediate. Alliances Jin-ho had spent a decade building began to fracture within hours. Two of his shipping partners withdrew by morning. A rival house, sensing weakness, moved on territory Jin-ho had held for 8 years. Jin-ho's men urged him toward retaliation, the kind of decisive, brutal response that had built his reputation in the first place. He refused. Sir, if we don't respond by tonight, we lose the western routes permanently, Director O warned. Then we lose them, Jin-ho said. You've never let territory go without a fight in 20 years. I've never had something worth more than territory before, Jin-ho said, and for the first time his men understood exactly how much had changed. Min-jun, cornered by his own family's fury at the mission's incomplete execution, showed up at the house one final time, not for revenge, but for something closer to surrender. I came to tell you I'm done, he said to Jin-ho, standing in the same driveway where, months earlier, everything had begun to unravel. Whatever you decide about the routes, about my family, I'm not going to fight you for her anymore. She was never really mine to fight for. I think some part of me always knew that. Jin-ho studied him for a long moment. Your father spent 10 years trying to destroy something I built. I understand the impulse better than you'd think, but what you did to her, using someone who trusted you as a weapon, that I will never forgive, regardless of what happens between our families. I know, Min-jun said quietly.
For what it's worth, despite how it started, I did fall for her. I don't expect that to matter to you. It matters to me." He left without waiting for a response, and neither Jin-ho nor Emily saw him again for a long time. And that's when she understood not every ending needs an enemy defeated. Some simply need the truth finally spoken to set everyone free. The wedding took place the following spring, small and quiet by the standards of Jin-ho's world. No photographers, no rival families invited to posture and calculate, just the people who had actually stood beside them through everything. Director O walked Emily part way down the aisle himself, gruffly insisting it wasn't sentiment, just tradition, while everyone in attendance could see the tears he refused to acknowledge. Miss Han, the tutor who had taught a starving 9-year-old Korean her first words, sat in the front row, weeping openly, unguarded in a way she'd never permitted herself in 15 years of careful discipline. Jin-ho, waiting at the end of the aisle in a simple dark suit, looked less like the feared name whispered across 3 districts, and more like a man who had finally set down a weight he'd carried for 20 years. "You're not going to cry, are you?" Emily whispered as she reached him, teasing gently. "I've buried men without shedding a tear," Jin-ho murmured back. "You'll have to give me a moment to figure out how to handle this instead." He didn't manage it, neither did she. Their kiss at the altar was unhurried, certain, the kind that belonged to 2 people who had finally stopped being afraid of what they always knew was true. A year later, in the same house where a 9-year-old girl had once been given a blanket and a bed, and eventually an entire life she never could have imagined for herself, a son was born. Jin-ho held him for the first time in the early hours of the morning, the room quiet except for the small, insistent sounds of a boy who had no idea yet what kind of world he'd been born into, or what kind of man had waited 20 years, without ever fully admitting it to himself, to hold something like this. "You have my stubbornness already," Emily said softly from the bed, watching him. "God help us all," Jin-ho murmured, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the same sound Emily had once heard through an office door and mistaken briefly for something that belonged to someone else. He looked down at his son, small and impossibly fragile against his hands, hands that built an empire, that had done things he would spend the rest of his life making peace with, that once had wrapped a coat around a dying child in the rain, because some instinct in him even then knew she was worth saving. "I used to think power was the only thing that could never be taken from a man," he said quietly, more to himself than to Emily. "I was wrong. This is the first thing I've ever had that no rival, no betrayal, no war could ever touch." Emily reached for his hand, and he let her take it, no walls left standing between them at all. And that's when he finally understood. Real strength was never about what a man could conquer. It was about what he was finally brave enough to love. Now that you've seen the whole story, was Jin-ho's true victory finally taking back control of his empire, or was it holding his son for the first time? Tell us which moment felt like the real ending to you. We read every answer.